I saw something the other day that frustrated me. The announcement of the new Penguin show that's been coming out for a while from Matt Reeves as a part of his Batman universe, and apparently Penguin's name is going to be changed in the show. It's not going to be Oswald Cobblepot because apparently Matt Reeves and co. thought that that name was too unrealistic. They needed a name to sound more grounded for their universe of the Batman. So they have changed Oswald Cobblepot's name, which was apparently too much for their show, into Oz Cobb. Oz. That sounds like a corn to me. Oz Cobb, the new name for the Penguin. I'm not sure that that actually makes it sound less silly or more grounded and realistic. I think it actually makes it sound more silly, but really, I couldn't really care less about that part. What bothered me, though, was the reasoning behind it, that apparently they say that they need it so that they can make the Penguin or Oswald Cobblepot feel more grounded for their universe, more realistic. And this continues on with a trend that I've seen, and just something that Matt Reeves has talked about a lot lately, that he says his Batman universe will never be fantastical. It will always be grounded. A couple years ago, because these things have been in the works for a long time, we heard that Clayface might appear in new Batman projects, and I was really, really excited for this because we've never gotten Clayface on screen before, and we're finally in a time when the technology exists to show the real version of Clayface, the one that can transform and into anybody, and that's this big mound of clay. And I thought that'd be really interesting to adapt, especially with his storyline. But back then we heard that if we were going to get Clayface, it was going to be the Golden Age one, the one that just uses masks and stuff. Boring. And that's what we keep hearing from the Batman universe, this constant attempt to be realistic, to be grounded, to remove all of the fantasy elements from Batman. And that's been a really big problem with me and being a Batman fan lately, is because I want to be excited for stuff that Matt Reeves is doing in the future, and I liked the Batman a whole lot when it came out. But what keeps me going back and forth on it is that it's another attempt just to desperately make Batman so realistic and remove a lot of elements from his character. Like, has Catwoman ever been referred to as Catwoman in a film since the 90s? I think she was just Selina in the Dark Knight universe, and she was just Selina in the Reeves movie, and her cat ears were just coincidentally her mask that went up, or her beanie that she wears just incidentally have things that look like cat ears, but she's never been Catwoman. She's never had her actual cat suit. So many characters in the Batman universe can't be done. Like, I'm hearing that the reason why Robin hasn't been appearing is because they think that it's unrealistic for Batman to have a teen sidekick. And that is, once again, really my problem with Matt Reeves' Batman and what's become of Batman in general. It goes back to the influence of Christopher Nolan. Batman and Robin was a terrible movie that tried to be overly campy, and it flopped in 1997. So when Christopher Nolan came along, he brought his own vision to Batman and wanted to reimagine the character in the most realistic, grounded setting he could, as much as you can with a guy who dresses up in a bat costume and beats up criminals. And Nolan's movies were very, very successful, and I love the Nolan movies. Christopher Nolan is my favorite director. Batman Begins and The Dark Knight are some of my favorite movies of all time, and it did amazing for what it was. And I think that certain takes on the character, like Heath Ledger's Joker, wouldn't work unless you did it in a realistic setting, unless you gave him the makeup and have that mystique that he's just a normal guy in makeup, but you don't know where he comes from. Like, that works in the universe of Nolan's Batman. But here's the thing. We've had our take on realistic Batman. It was done very well, and I've been wanting to move on from that from a long time, because as good as the realistic take on Batman was from Christopher Nolan, it was done well. It didn't really have anything I thought needed to be revisited, and there's so much of Batman that is left on the table that can't be explored if you constantly keep making Batman realistic. And that's what I really wanted to see. Like, once again, Robin. People think that that's not grounded and realistic enough. I want to see Robin. We haven't gotten a Robin on a theatrical movie since 1997. We need to see him again. But then Matt Reeves comes along, the first Batman in years, because Ben Affleck's Batman movie never got off the ground, and he just does the exact same thing as Nolan. He's just trying to mimic Christopher Nolan and make making everything uber realistic, because Nolan movies were just so successful that people want to mimic that. They want to mimic that in everything that Batman does. But to me, that's not really creative, and that's not really Matt Reeves making this universe his own. It just feels that he's trying to copy what Nolan did a lot, and I'm not a big fan of that. But here's what's more of a problem with it, rather than just doing the same thing that Nolan did, is the way that Matt Reeves talks about this, and even going back to the way some people behind the scenes who worked on the Nolan properties talked about it, is that they just really sound like they're embarrassed of the source material. Now, I never read an interview with Nolan where he sounded like that, but other people that worked on the films with him, like one of them talked about how he thought Martian Manhunter was just such a ridiculous name and he would never be caught dead doing any of that. And then Matt Reeves is constantly talking about how he needs this to be grounded. He needs it to be realistic. He needs Oswald Cobblepot to be changed into Ozcobb because he thought the name was too silly. And we now find out that in the Penguin show, the Penguin won't even keep his name, the Penguin, because they seem to think that it's just way too silly. They seem embarrassed by it, which only gives credence to my theory that as good as a show as the Penguin is objectively, that it was likely an original crime show that they used the Batman IP to get off the ground. And it just comes off as being embarrassed of the source material, and that's what I really don't like. It comes off as these directors and these people working on Batman just need to be taken seriously so badly. They can't have this thing be so connected to its comic book roots. It needs to be grounded. It needs to be realistic. It needs to be that way in order to be perceived as adult. And this is a problem that's come up in talking about fiction in general. Like if you go to the Oscars, the films that they usually award are always the grounded, realistic dramas. Like it's so hard for a sci-fi movie or a superhero movie or a fantasy to ever get the prestigious awards for like screenplay or best director or best film. There are exceptions, but not anymore, because the Academy and the elites think that the grounded dramas are like the peak of storytelling. And I mean, even the elite directors like Martin Scorsese, they think that the grounded dramas the grounded realistic dramas are always the peak of cinema. The stuff that is really realistic, the stuff that has no fantasy in it and no unrealistic elements in it whatsoever. And that's the sort of thinking that Matt Reeves and other people like him are following with Batman, that this is a property that's very successful, and if you have to make it as realistic as possible to get it to be taken seriously. And I just completely disagree with that, because to me, saying that like drama, like only grounded dramas, like that's the peak of art and storytelling, that's basically saying that the more limitations you have on where you can go with a story, then the better it is. The more it reflects just what you see around you every day, then the better it is. And I completely disagree with that. It's like being given an array of colors, all these different colors, but you only ever choose to use black, and you consider yourself the grandest artist ever because you've only ever explored one color. And that obviously is not true. Fantasy allows you to explore things that you would never be able to see in real life, and it opens up all these worlds for you to be able to create and explore things that people would have never thought of before, that you could have never visited. It's like having a portal, having literal portals to other worlds. It is the biggest mind opener possible. It allows you to expand on the grounded human emotion and open it up to other ways. Like talking about Batman, you have a character, Mr. Freeze, and I've been hoping for them to do that character, as the Batman 2 is said to be set in winter, and they could do it realistically, I suppose, but I'm afraid that they won't do it at all. But here's the thing, Mr. Freeze, the idea of him having an accident where he is cold for the rest of his life. He can never feel warmth again. He has to always be cold. His wife is in this constant state of being neither dead nor alive, also just frozen in this state where he constantly watches her and wishes he could do something, and how that expands on him, how he's dead to all emotion, but he still feels something to his wife, and how the idea of him being locked in this cold suit is a metaphor for him being dead to all emotion and just losing everything important to him. Like, that is the story that fantasy helps you to unlock. It helps you to explore those emotions and all of those kinds of things. Or we could go over to a character like Poison Ivy, and how she's a character who was seduced and taken advantage of by her mentor and experimented on, and she becomes basically basically this plant goddess who has the power of using toxins, of poisoning people, of manipulating people, of literally manipulating and seducing people with her powers, and how that is her becoming basically the monster that created her. And she does that to other people. And she's actually a very sad character with her backstory, and she still has some humanity to her. But the fantasy elements and the fact of what her powers allow her to do, given the acts that were committed on her, that enhances the story. And to me, that is always what made Batman so appealing, is it's all of these human emotions and very human stories, and very intense stories dealing with a lot of madness and psychology and stuff like that, but expanded with the fantasy elements, taking it a step further. And that's what I really want to see on screen. I don't want people to feel afraid of using Poison Ivy as she's accurately supposed to be used, or Mr. Freeze, or Clayface, depending on which version you take, an actor who tries to use chemicals to change his appearance, and then he just becomes this undefined blob who can only ever shape himself as other people, but his true form is as this blob. Once again, the emotions and the meaning of these stories is explored in the fantasy elements. Robin, the teenage Robin, or 9 years old. Now, maybe they don't have to go as far as making him 9 years old as he was in the original, but he is an extension of Batman's character, and Batman trying to help someone not go through what he went through and when his parents died. Like, that's the whole point of Robin, and the whole point of Dick Grayson becoming Nightwing is he does become a different version of Batman. He doesn't just become a Batman copy, and that is very important to the development of both characters. And once again, there's just so much great stuff in Batman comics that includes the fantasy element. One of the best comics I've ever read is the Catwoman origin story that refers to her as Catwoman and goes into how she relates to being a cat, how cats are aloof and independent, and that's who she always was. And people would try to kill her, but it was like she had 9 lives because she's a survivalist. And that was incredible, and we probably would never see that on screen because they're so afraid of the fantasy elements. Like, when you get into superhero characters and you really know them, you know that the fantasy elements and the sci-fi elements and the extreme and the unrealistic stuff is allowing us to explore these extreme situations that we would never see and question, like, how would we react to them, or how would a person react to this situation? That is what literally opens it up for all of these different explorations. So for someone to be embarrassed of that, embarrassed of the source material, and thinks it somehow makes it more mature and more adult or more artistic to limit themselves from all of that, that is just ridiculous to me. And as skilled a filmmaker as Matt Reeves is, and as gorgeous looking film as the Batman is, and as well cast as Robert Pattinson was, it just makes me lose a lot of respect for him that he can't see that. And in my opinion, he seems like he just desperately wants to be taken seriously by his peers by being afraid of the comic book elements of the characters that he's working with. The fantasy is not what limits stories. Fantasy is what makes these stories limitless. It reminds me, as I was doing my kids movie video when I was talking about how C.S. Lewis would talk about how he stopped being so worried about reading fantasy when he became an adult, because he stopped being worried about being perceived as an adult, because he saw that other adults who were more immature in their mindset were worried about reading fantasy because they saw them as childish and they wanted to be perceived a certain way. And he stopped, once again, trying to be like that because he became mature, and he stopped worrying about other adults perceiving him as mature and adult. He just enjoyed the stories he knew were good. And he and J.R.R. Tolkien were big proponents about fantasy being the best genre that is limitless in its potential and the imagination that it provides you to have. But Matt Reeves, it apparently has an immature mindset, and these other people who worked on Batman, not Christopher Nolan, because I've never seen him disparage the fantasy elements, even though he chose to have a different take on it, but they are so concerned with being perceived as grounded and realistic and mature and adult, they're actually limiting themselves and ignoring the great stories and potential of Batman. And for me as a fan, that's just why I'm frustrated that we're in this Reeves verse, and I just don't know how Batman's going to be going forward, with James Gunn maybe or maybe not doing something depending on how his Superman film does, because I want to get actual Batman. I want to get a director who's not embarrassed of the fantasy elements and who really understands these characters as a whole and isn't constantly trying to change them just because they want to be taken more seriously by the right people, I suppose. You are literally limiting the stories of Batman. But that's all I got for you guys today. What do do you think of this video? Do you agree that they should stop being embarrassed of the source material in Batman and that there is just so much potential in it? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you, supporters on Patreon, supporting this channel. If you want to help me out because I'm doing this all by myself, you can check out the link to the Patreon in the description, and I will see you guys next time.